The war in Europe was ending, but the air still smelled of smoke and iron. In the shadow of the Austrian Alps, a U.S. Army convoy rumbled slowly along a narrow road toward the small town of Riyadh. The soldiers' faces were tense, their rifles ready. The war had a habit of striking even in its dying moments. Snowmelt trickled down the rocky slopes, glistening like veins of mercury beneath the overcast sky. Then, on a clearing ahead, the lead jeep stopped. A white flag waved weakly in the wind. Out of the mist stepped a group of German men in tattered uniforms and oil-stained coats. They were not regular soldiers. Their hands were raised, not in surrender to save their lives, but to offer something far more valuable. In a wooden crate behind them lay blueprints, notebooks, and fragments of a weapon the Allies barely understood, the V-2 rocket. One of the men, tall and hollow-eyed, whispered to the officer approaching, "We are scientists. We come to work for you." His name was Wernher von Braun. The soldiers looked at one another, uncertain. The war had been fought to defeat the regime these men had served. Yet here they were, offering the keys to the next age of warfare. As the snow drifted gently around the convoy, a quiet realization set in. This was not the end of a war. It was the beginning of a new one, a war for knowledge, power, and the future itself. The decision made in that alpine clearing would shape the world's destiny, from the deserts of New Mexico to the void of space. By the winter of 1943, the war in Europe had entered a phase of desperate innovation. Germany, bombed nightly by the Royal Air Force and pressed from the east by the Soviet tide, turned to science as its final weapon. Amid the ruins of the Reich, laboratories became front lines, and scientists became soldiers. The regime poured immense resources into secret programs designed to change the course of the conflict: jet propulsion, radar countermeasures, and, most ominously, long-range missiles. The epicenter of this new warfare was a small complex hidden in the forests of northern Germany, a place that would become both a triumph of engineering and a symbol of human cruelty: Piemont. In 1937, a young engineer named Wernher von Braun, barely in his mid-20s, had been appointed technical director of the German Army's rocket development program under Major General Walter Dornberger. What began as a dream of spaceflight soon hardened into a weapon of vengeance. By 1942, the first successful test of the A-4 rocket, later renamed the V-2, marked the birth of the world's first ballistic missile. It soared 190 kilometers into the sky before crashing into the Baltic Sea, faster than sound, unstoppable by any defense known to man. For the first time in history, humanity had reached the edge of space, not for exploration, but for war. By 1944, V-2 rockets rained down on London, Antwerp, and Liège with terrifying precision. Civilians called them the soundless killers. One moment of silence, then a thunderclap that shattered entire streets. More than 3,000 rockets were launched in less than a year. Each one carried nearly a ton of explosives. Each one was a product of engineering genius fused with human suffering. Behind the polished diagrams and precise mathematics lay a dark secret hidden deep beneath the Harz Mountains. After Allied bombers destroyed much of Piemont in August 1943, the German High Command ordered production moved underground. The new site was called Mittelwerk, and it was built using slave labor from the Dora-Mittelbau concentration camp. Tens of thousands of prisoners, men from France, Poland, the Soviet Union, and beyond, were forced to work in appalling conditions. They lived in tunnels without sunlight, suffocated by dust and fumes, often dying of starvation before they saw a completed rocket. It was estimated that for every V-2 launched, more than 10 lives were lost in its making. Von Braun himself visited the tunnels and witnessed the horror firsthand, a stain that would haunt the legacy of his later achievements. As 1945 dawned, Germany was collapsing. The Allies pushed into the Rhineland, the Soviets closed in from the east, and the Nazi command structure began to fracture. Yet amid the chaos, American intelligence realized that something extraordinary lay hidden in the heart of the Reich. Reports from British and American airmen described strange launch sites and shattered missiles found among the ruins. The Allies understood that the same technology capable of striking London could, in different hands, reach across oceans or into orbit. The race to seize Germany's scientists, documents, and equipment began before the war was even over. The U.S. Army's Alsos mission, led by Colonel Boris Pash and scientist Samuel Goudsmit, had already been scouring Europe for atomic research and key personnel. Now a specialized group known as T-Forces, Technical Intelligence Units, was tasked with finding the rocket experts before the Soviets did. Every kilometer gained on the battlefield could mean the difference between controlling the future of warfare or watching it fall behind the Iron Curtain. In the final weeks of the war, entire convoys of Allied soldiers drove, not toward Berlin, but toward Peenemünde, Nordhausen, and Bleischerode, the heart of Germany's technological empire. By late April, Peenemünde lay in ruins, and the Soviet army was only days away from the region. Von Braun and his team faced a terrible choice: surrender to the Soviets or risk everything to reach the Americans. They packed what remained of their research, blueprints, engine components, gyroscopic instruments, and fled south toward Bavaria, deliberately aiming for territory they believed the U.S. Army would soon control. For days they moved through war-torn villages, disguising trucks under canvas, burning documents they couldn't carry, and negotiating with local Wehrmacht units to avoid arrest as deserters. It was not loyalty to the Reich that drove them now, but survival, and perhaps an unspoken understanding that their knowledge had become more valuable than their past. When they were finally discovered by the 44th Infantry Division near Riut, the war had only days left. The Americans were uncertain whether to treat them as prisoners or assets. But one glance at the crates filled with rocket parts changed everything. The men who had once built Hitler's vengeance weapon now offered their genius to the very nations that had destroyed his empire. The U.S. Army realized the strategic gold mine they had uncovered. Orders were sent to gather all surviving documentation, capture the Mittelwerk facilities intact, and quietly relocate the scientists to secure zones. It was a new kind of operation, one that would not be discussed publicly for years. Thus began the first phase of what would soon be called Operation Paperclip, a program that blurred the lines between victory and compromise. For the Allies, the battlefields of Europe were closing, but a new battlefield was emerging, one fought not with tanks or bombs, but with equations, engines, and mines. The fate of global power was about to be rewritten, not in the ruins of Berlin, but in the laboratories of a new world rising from the ashes. The surrender at Riut was not a spontaneous act of mercy. It was the first domino in a deliberate American plan to seize Germany's scientific elite before anyone else could. Within days, U.S. Army intelligence began cataloging not just the scientists, but their families, equipment, and archives. The initial codename was Operation Overcast, a temporary measure to bring enemy specialists into Allied custody for debriefing. But as Washington realized the magnitude of the discovery, Overcast evolved into something larger, secret, and permanent: Operation Paperclip. The name itself came from a simple gesture: a paperclip attached to select personnel files, marking those whose Nazi affiliations would be quietly overlooked. In Washington, the idea of recruiting former Nazi scientists stirred immediate controversy. Many in the government viewed it as an ethical betrayal. These were men who had built Hitler's weapons and, in some cases, participated in programs tied to forced labor and human suffering. But others saw the world shifting too quickly from moral hesitation. The Soviet Union, advancing through eastern Germany, was already loading trains with scientists, engineers, and machinery bound for Moscow. Reports surfaced that the Soviets had seized parts of Peenemünde and captured engineers like Helmut Grotrup, who would later aid in the development of the R-1 and R-7 rockets. To American strategists, hesitation meant defeat, not on the battlefield, but in the laboratories of the future. The bureaucratic framework for this new race was built in haste. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JOA, became the central node overseeing the extraction, transport, and vetting of personnel. Behind closed doors, security officers reviewed dossiers that described each scientist's technical expertise alongside his political record. For many, the latter posed a problem. Werner von Braun, for example, had held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS, and many of his closest collaborators had similar ties. To make their transfer acceptable under U.S. law, officials literally paperclipped new identity files over the old ones, omitting references to Nazi involvement. It was a calculated compromise, one that reflected the cold pragmatism of the emerging post-war world. Logistically, the operation was immense. Crates of documents and prototype parts were shipped from Nordhausen, Bleischerode, and Mittelwerk to ports along the Rhine, then loaded onto cargo vessels bound for the United States. Families were relocated quietly, often under assumed names. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers prepared remote military installations, places like Fort Bliss, Texas, and the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, to house and employ the incoming specialists. Their official task, to assist American ordnance and missile divisions with experimental testing and development. Unofficially, they were the bridge between Hitler's vengeance weapons and America's future in space. Meanwhile, Britain and the Soviet Union launched similar missions of their own. The British organized Operation Surgeon and Operation Backfire, both designed to secure German aerospace expertise. Operation Backfire even conducted live V-2 launches on the North Sea coast in October 1945, using captured rockets and German crews under British supervision. Yet Britain's post-war economy and shrinking global influence limited the scale of their ambitions. The Soviets, by contrast, approached the effort with total ruthlessness. Under Operation Oso Aviakim in 1946, the NKVD forcibly relocated more than 2,000 German scientists, engineers, and their families to secret research centers within the Soviet Union. For them, cooperation was not a choice, it was survival. Against this geopolitical backdrop, Paperclip became more than a recruitment program. It was the opening move of the Cold War's scientific arms race. Every mind counted, every document mattered. The same men who had once designed weapons for the Reich were now courted as strategic assets by both superpowers. They represented decades of accumulated knowledge that could determine not just who built the next missile, but who reached the stars first. By late 1946, the first contingents of German scientists were already in America. They lived under guard, signed non-disclosure agreements, and began working alongside American engineers on captured V-2 hardware. To the public, these projects were cloaked in vague military language: upper atmosphere research, ballistics testing, aerodynamic analysis. In reality, they were the embryonic beginnings of America's rocket program. At White Sands, a desert once reserved for artillery practice, the first V-2 launch, conducted by a joint U.S.-German team, roared into the sky. It was a haunting echo of Peenemünde, but this time the trajectory pointed westward, not toward London. In Washington, the moral debates faded behind strategic necessity. President Truman, initially cautious, quietly authorized expanded recruitment. The State Department and War Department coordinated the steady intake of specialists throughout 1947 and 1948, while official public statements framed Paperclip as a temporary employment initiative. The truth was far more complex. What had begun as a short-term wartime measure was transforming into a cornerstone of American technological supremacy. By the end of the decade, hundreds of German scientists had been absorbed into the American defense and research infrastructure. Some worked for the Army Ordnance Department. Others joined the newly formed U.S. Air Force or lent their expertise to the emerging National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, which would one day evolve into NASA. A few remained under restricted watch, forbidden to travel or speak freely, but all shared one thing. Their pasts were buried under layers of secrecy, their futures rewritten by the victors of war. Operation Paperclip was not a single event, but a transformation, a transfer of intellect that blurred the moral lines between justice and necessity. In its classified briefings, America justified its decisions through the logic of survival. If they didn't take these men, the Soviets would. Yet beneath the political rhetoric, a question lingered quietly among those who knew the truth. Could a nation built on freedom afford to inherit its enemies' scientists and their sins? That question would follow America into the deserts of New Mexico, across the skies of Florida, and finally into the black expanse of space. When the war ended, the men of Piemont were not just prisoners, they were paradoxes. They had built the most advanced weapon in human history, yet now found themselves working for the same enemy they once tried to destroy. For many, Operation Paperclip became a strange kind of exile, a quiet, sterile redemption offered not through forgiveness, but through usefulness. The American officers who received them at Fort Bliss and White Sands called them specialists. To the scientists themselves, it felt like an unspoken contract, one that traded guilt for opportunity. The human angle of Operation Paperclip is a story of conflicted survival. Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, Arthur Rudolph, and hundreds of others arrived in the United States with a mixture of exhaustion and curiosity. Their new lives were built in military barracks, surrounded by fences, guarded not out of fear they might escape, but out of fear they might talk. They were given English lessons, rationed food, and supervised trips into nearby towns. Some struggled to reconcile their new identities. Others adapted quickly, fascinated by the American abundance that stood in stark contrast to the bombed ruins they had left behind. Von Braun, always the visionary, spoke of space exploration with the same enthusiasm that had once driven his pursuit of the V-2. To him, the future was a blank page. To his American handlers, it was a strategic frontier. The tactical angle of Paperclip was far more immediate. When the U.S. Army brought the German teams to Fort Bliss, they were not seeking abstract dreams of space. They were seeking weapons. The United States had the resources and the industrial base, but it lacked the years of experience in rocketry that Germany had painfully acquired. The V-2 rocket was not just a weapon. It was a textbook of physics, metallurgy, and engineering innovation decades ahead of anything America had developed. The turbopump system alone, capable of feeding ethanol and liquid oxygen into a combustion chamber at speeds exceeding 8,000 revolutions per minute, was an engineering marvel. American engineers studied its design, tracing each valve, seal, and weld, realizing that this technology could serve as the foundation for an entirely new generation of missiles. At the White Sands Proving Ground, the desert became a laboratory of the future. Teams of German and American engineers worked side by side, rebuilding V-2s from crates of salvage parts shipped from Europe. Each launch was both an experiment and a rehearsal for a new era of warfare. The first successful test, on April 16, 1946, sent a V-2 roaring into the stratosphere, leaving behind a white spiral trail that lingered like a scar in the New Mexico sky. Data recovered from its flight provided the United States with its first glimpse into upper atmospheric conditions, temperature, pressure, cosmic radiation. What had once been a terror weapon now became a tool of science. Yet, even as the rockets rose, the ghosts of Dora and Mittelwerk seemed to rise with them. The technological angle of Operation Paperclip revealed the sheer scale of what the Americans had acquired. The V-2 was not merely a missile, it was a prototype for the future. Standing over 14 meters tall and weighing 12 tons, it represented the fusion of chemistry, physics, and engineering at a level that most Allied scientists could only admire. Its liquid fuel propulsion system generated more than 56,000 pounds of thrust. Its inertial guidance system, primitive by modern standards, was the ancestor of the computer-controlled navigation systems that would one day guide spacecraft. The German engineers introduced new alloys, sealing methods, and heat-resistant materials that transformed how American industries approached high-performance design. For the United States, Paperclip was not only about catching up, it was about leaping ahead. The Cold War was already taking shape, and the Americans understood that whoever controlled the skies would control the future. The rocket, once a weapon of vengeance, became a symbol of ascension, literally and politically. The same principles that had guided AV-2 toward London could now guide a satellite into orbit or a nuclear warhead across continents. It was knowledge that changed the calculus of war forever. The leadership angle of Operation Paperclip was equally pivotal. Visionaries and bureaucrats clashed behind closed doors over what to do with the German scientists. Major General Holger N. Toftoy, one of the early champions of the operation, saw the potential immediately. He argued that men like von Braun were indispensable if America wanted to master ballistic missile technology before the Soviets did. Others, including senior officials in the State Department, warned that bringing Nazis into the country would stain America's moral standing. In the end, pragmatism prevailed over principle. Toftoy and his allies won the argument, not through speeches, but through results. Each successful test at White Sands silenced a critic. Each scientific paper justified another extension of the program. Meanwhile, von Braun's quiet charisma and relentless ambition began to reshape how the Americans viewed him. He wasn't treated as a captive, but as a consultant, eventually earning the respect and envy of the very officers assigned to monitor him. He learned to navigate the American system with remarkable skill, blending technical brilliance with political finesse. When asked about his past, he rarely denied it. Instead, he reframed it. "My work," he would later say, "has always been about reaching for the stars." To many, it sounded like redemption. To others, it was evasion. But in the growing shadow of the Cold War, moral clarity was a luxury no superpower could afford. By the late 1940s, Paperclip's first generation of projects was complete. The U.S. Army had absorbed the fundamentals of German rocketry. Engineers who had once fought on opposite sides now sat together, calculating trajectories, testing fuels, and sketching designs for missiles that would one day bear American flags. Yet beneath the collaboration lay a quiet unease, a recognition that history was being rewritten in real time. The scientists' crimes, the forced labor, the complicity in the Nazi war machine, all of it faded into classified archives as the focus shifted toward what they could deliver next. America was building its technological supremacy on a foundation poured by its former enemies. The first launches at White Sands were hailed as milestones of progress. Newspapers published blurred photographs of rockets piercing the clouds, headlines praising new advances in missile science. What the headlines didn't say was that every bolt and circuit in those machines carried a German fingerprint. The public saw only innovation. The government saw power. And for the men of Peenemünde, now wearing American uniforms, standing beneath an unfamiliar flag, it was neither victory nor defeat. It was survival through reinvention. Operation Paperclip had proven that in modern warfare, the spoils were not land or gold, but intellect. The U.S. had not only captured scientists, it had captured the future. The geopolitical angle of Operation Paperclip revealed the full magnitude of what the Americans had set in motion. The Second World War had barely ended when the world divided into two camps, each armed not just with soldiers and tanks, but with scientists, engineers, and the blueprints of the future. For the United States, Paperclip was both shield and sword, a preemptive strike in the intellectual war of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had already seized its share of German expertise under Operation Oso Aviacum, relocating thousands of specialists to remote research cities deep within its territory. There, under armed supervision, they reconstructed Germany's lost technology for Stalin's new empire. To American strategists, every rocket launched in the Soviet Union was a reminder of what could have been lost. Paperclip became an invisible arms race, one fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories and wind tunnels. By 1947, both powers were developing parallel missile systems based on German designs. The Soviets tested their first copies of the V-2, the R-1, under the guidance of captured engineers. Meanwhile, in the American desert, the Paperclip scientists worked under the Army's Ordnance Guided Missile Division, advancing propulsion systems and control mechanisms. Both nations were learning from the same original textbook, written in German. Yet their ambitions diverged. The Soviet approach was centralized, secretive, and militarized to the core. The American path evolved within a broader framework, military funding combined with civilian research, universities, and private contractors. This difference would later define the contrasting styles of the space race itself. Soviet efficiency built on fear and discipline. American progress built on competition and freedom. But in those early years, both sides shared one undeniable truth. The legacy of Nazi science was now the cornerstone of global power. As the Cold War intensified, Paperclip took on a new identity. It was no longer a recovery operation. It had become a national project. Intelligence agencies began recruiting beyond rocketry into fields like aerodynamics, jet propulsion, nuclear physics, and even medicine. Men who had once designed aircraft for the Luftwaffe now worked on American jet bombers. Others who had researched nerve agents for the Wehrmacht found themselves advising U.S. chemical laboratories on countermeasures and antidotes. The moral boundaries blurred further with each passing year. What had started as an urgent wartime decision was becoming institutionalized, normalized, even celebrated within certain circles of government. This brings the story to its most haunting angle, the moral one. Operation Paperclip was, at its core, a moral paradox disguised as progress. The program delivered undeniable results, technological leaps that changed the trajectory of human history, but it also buried thousands of victims under the weight of classified files. The American public, fed stories of scientific triumph and Cold War necessity, never saw the darker side of the operation. Few were told that some of these scientists had overseen slave labor at Dora Mittelbaugh or conducted experiments on unwilling subjects in concentration camps. Official documents were altered, testimonies ignored, and ethics quietly suspended in the name of national security. It was the price of victory in a world that no longer divided heroes and villains neatly. Yet within the moral fog, there were moments of quiet reckoning. A handful of American officers who had witnessed the horrors of Mittelwerk never forgot what they saw. Some resigned in protest when they realized the men responsible were now being given homes, salaries, and citizenship. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of rockets and the language of strategy. We cannot afford sentiment. One internal memo declared, when the enemy is building the same weapons with the same men. It was a justification repeated in every era since, the idea that survival excuses compromise. The moral legacy of Operation Paperclip endures because it asks a question that cannot be answered easily. Can the pursuit of knowledge ever be separated from the morality of those who create it? The American space program would one day stand as a monument to scientific progress and human ambition. Yet its foundations were laid by men who had once built engines of destruction for a genocidal regime. This duality became the unspoken truth behind the smiling photographs of engineers at launch pads and laboratories. The future was being built by men haunted by the past. By the dawn of the 1950s, the transformation was complete. The German scientists of Operation Paperclip were no longer refugees. They were Americans now, living in quiet suburbs, sending their children to local schools, and designing rockets under new stars and new flags. The program that began in secrecy had evolved into an open collaboration that would define decades of scientific advancement. But beneath every achievement, every successful launch, and every newspaper headline about American progress, the same question lingered: what price had the free world paid to claim the knowledge of its former enemy? That question would soon become unavoidable, as the ambitions of Paperclip reached their zenith in a moment that would shake both the earth and the heavens. The desert of southern New Mexico was quiet at dawn. The horizon stretched endlessly under a pale orange sky, and the only sound was the hum of generators warming to life. It was 1946, barely a year after the surrender in Europe, but for the men of Operation Paperclip, the war had never truly ended. It had simply changed form. At White Sands Proving Ground, a landscape once scarred by artillery tests now served as a launch pad for the future. Here, far from the ruins of Germany, the same engineers who had once designed Hitler's vengeance weapon were preparing to send it skyward again, but this time under an American flag. The preparations were meticulous. Technicians in khaki uniforms moved across the sand, their boots crunching over steel plates. German engineers, wearing borrowed army jackets, checked valves, cables, and fuel lines, communicating in a mixture of English and German. The massive V-2 rocket stood poised on its launch platform, sleek and black against the desert light. Its polished nose cone caught the reflection of the rising sun. For some, it was a symbol of redemption. For others, a reminder of destruction reborn. The irony was not lost on anyone. The same machine that had once terrorized London was now being celebrated as a beacon of scientific progress. At precisely 7 a.m. on April 16, 1946, a countdown echoed through the desert. A deep roar followed, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the earth itself. The V-2 lifted off in a column of fire, arching into the clear blue sky. Cameras captured its ascent, tracking its trail until it disappeared beyond sight. For the first time, an American rocket, built with German expertise, had touched the edge of space. The scientists watched in silence. Some smiled faintly. Others stood motionless, as if reliving a past they could never escape. When the data was recovered hours later, it confirmed what the Americans had hoped. The rocket had reached over 100 kilometers in altitude. Humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. The missile of war had become the instrument of exploration. This launch marked the true beginning of America's rocketry era. Over the next several years, dozens of V-2 rockets would be reassembled, tested, and launched at White Sands. Each carried instruments, thermometers, cameras, cosmic ray detectors, turning the weapon into a scientific probe. On October 24, 1946, one of these modified V-2s carried a camera fitted to its nose cone. As it spun through the upper atmosphere, it captured a series of black and white images, the first photographs of Earth from space. When developed, the images showed the curvature of the planet, clouds swirling over the southwestern United States, and the faint outline of the horizon bending into infinity. Those blurred frames changed everything. For the first time, humanity could see its own home from above. The success of the White Sands program transformed the German engineers into invaluable assets. Their names began to circulate through the corridors of Washington and the Pentagon, not as former enemies, but as pioneers. Wernher von Braun emerged as the informal leader, his technical expertise matched only by his gift for persuasion. He spoke passionately about the future, insisting that the rocket's true destiny was not in warfare, but in space exploration. In private, he understood that his past required redemption, and the stars, he believed, might offer it. The U.S. Army, however, saw more immediate applications. Long before the dream of spaceflight could be realized, America needed missiles, powerful, accurate, and capable of delivering new kinds of weapons across continents. By 1949, von Braun and his team were transferred to Fort Bliss near El Paso, where they trained American soldiers and engineers in the fundamentals of missile design. They built test stands, wrote technical manuals, and helped transform a generation of American technicians into rocket specialists. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department quickly recognized that these men had compressed decades of experience into a single program. What the United States lacked in experimentation, it compensated for through adaptation. The German methods of design, testing, and failure analysis became the foundation of American missile engineering. Yet, as the work advanced, the political landscape grew darker. The world was no longer united by victory, but divided by ideology. The Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe, and the Soviet Union was advancing rapidly in both nuclear weapons and missile development. In 1949, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, shocking the West. The need for reliable, long-range delivery systems became an obsession in Washington. Paperclip scientists suddenly found themselves at the center of a new military race, the dawn of the Cold War missile era. At this turning point, the moral ambiguity of Paperclip faded behind the urgency of survival. American generals spoke openly of deterrence and strategic balance, terms that replaced the language of justice and retribution. The V-2 was no longer an artifact of Germany's defeat. It was a prototype for America's future power. Von Braun's team was tasked with designing improved versions, longer range, higher payload, better guidance. From these efforts would emerge the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, machines that could deliver nuclear warheads across continents, or, under different missions, carry satellites and astronauts into orbit. In the deserts of New Mexico and the labs of Alabama, the boundaries between science and war blurred completely. Engineers spoke of trajectories and thrust, but behind every equation lay the unspoken truth that these same principles could annihilate cities or carry humanity beyond its cradle. The Cold War was no longer just a contest of armies. It was a race for the mastery of the heavens. As the 1950s began, the work of the Paperclip scientists expanded under new contracts and growing budgets. Von Braun and his core team were eventually moved to the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, a permanent base where their ambitions could finally take shape without restriction. There, they would build America's first generation of guided missiles, laying the technical groundwork for the space race yet to come. The world was changing rapidly, and for the men who once fled through the snow of Bavaria, the stakes had never been higher. The launch at White Sands had proven one thing beyond doubt. The rocket was no longer a weapon of one nation. It was the weapon of the future. And in the hands of the victors, it was about to redefine what victory meant. By 1950, a quiet revolution was underway in Huntsville, Alabama. The once sleepy southern town, surrounded by cotton fields and red clay roads, became home to one of the most advanced military research centers in the world. The Redstone Arsenal, formerly a wartime munitions plant, had been reborn as the nerve center of America's missile development program. Here, Wernher von Braun and his team, now numbering hundreds, found both a laboratory and a refuge. Their days were filled with calculations, test stand fires, and endless drafts of designs. Their nights were spent in modest rented homes, attending church picnics and neighborhood gatherings, blending into a society that had no idea who they truly were. What had once been Operation Paperclip was now institutionalized science, fueled by Cold War urgency and a belief that the next great battlefield would be the sky itself. The team's first major achievement at Redstone was the PGM-11 Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V-2 but refined for American use. Standing taller with improved guidance and a new engine design, the Redstone became the first large ballistic missile in the U.S. arsenal. Every part of its structure, its fuel systems, electronics, and aerodynamic profile carried the unmistakable fingerprint of German engineering. Yet its purpose had changed. Where the V-2 had been a weapon of desperation, the Redstone was a weapon of deterrence. In the early 1950s, when tensions between Washington and Moscow deepened over Korea and Eastern Europe, the Redstone served as both a symbol and a warning. America now possessed the means to deliver destruction across oceans within minutes. But von Braun's ambitions extended far beyond warfare. To him, each missile was a step toward a dream he had held since youth, the dream of spaceflight. In press interviews and internal memos, he began to speak openly about launching satellites, exploring the moon, and sending humans beyond Earth's atmosphere. His ideas found a small but growing audience among American scientists and visionaries. Yet within the military establishment, the response was cautious. The Pentagon wanted weapons, not dreams. It was not until October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, that the world, and America, finally listened. The beeping signal of Sputnik pierced the night sky and the American psyche alike. For the first time, the Soviet Union had taken the lead in a field that the United States had assumed it dominated. The small metal sphere, no larger than a beach ball, circled the Earth every 96 minutes, visible to anyone with a telescope. It was a technical marvel and a political earthquake. In living rooms across America, families looked upward and felt both awe and fear. The age of space had begun, and America was suddenly behind. Newspapers screamed headlines about a red moon and the Russian sky. Politicians demanded answers. the U.S. government turned, almost instinctively, to the very man who had been preparing for this moment all along. Von Braun's team at Redstone proposed an immediate solution: modify the existing Jupiter-C rocket, itself a derivative of the Redstone, to carry a small scientific payload into orbit. For months, bureaucratic hesitation had delayed such a launch. But after Sputnik, hesitation was no longer an option. On the freezing night of January 31st, 1958, at Cape Canaveral, Florida, the air trembled as the Jupiter-C ignited. In its nose cone was Explorer 1, America's first satellite. As the rocket rose into the sky, every control room across the nation held its breath. Minutes later, the signal came through. Explorer 1 was in orbit. The United States was back in the race. The data transmitted by Explorer 1 led to one of the most important scientific discoveries of the century: the Van Allen radiation belts, zones of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. It was a triumph not only for science, but for national pride. Von Braun, once a foreign engineer under scrutiny, was now hailed as a hero of the space age. His name appeared in newspapers, his image on magazine covers. He gave interviews speaking not of missiles, but of humanity's destiny among the stars. The transformation was complete, from a scientist of the Reich to an architect of America's future. Yet not everyone celebrated without unease. Within government archives, and among those who remember the origins of Operation Paperclip, there remained a lingering discomfort. The same man, now leading America's march into space, had once stood beneath the swastika at Piedmont. The same equations that powered Explorer 1 had guided the V-2s that devastated London. It was a paradox America chose not to confront publicly. In the fever of competition with the Soviet Union, moral questions were postponed for another time, a time that would never truly arrive. Following the success of Explorer 1, the U.S. established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, in July 1958. The Redstone Arsenal's missile team was absorbed into NASA's new Marshall Space Flight Center, also in Huntsville. It was there that von Braun's group began conceptualizing the Saturn family of rockets, immense machines capable of carrying humans to the moon. The technology that had once been born in underground tunnels filled with slave labor was now aimed toward the heavens. Each launch brought the world closer to a moment when humanity would leave Earth entirely. Still, beneath the celebration, the duality of Paperclip remained. The moral debts of the past had not vanished. They had merely been reclassified under national security. As the space age unfolded, von Braun became both a visionary and a contradiction, an emblem of how the 20th century blurred the lines between progress and guilt. His speeches inspired millions, yet his silence about Dora and Mittelwerk endured. When the Saturn V finally thundered into the sky in 1967, carrying the hopes of the Apollo program, it also carried the unspoken legacy of those who had suffered to build the technology that made it possible. The climax of Operation Paperclip was not a single launch or a single achievement. It was the realization that history had shifted its course. The men who once built weapons of vengeance had helped humanity touch the stars. But whether that transformation was redemption or simply reinvention remained a question only history could answer. When the dust of the 1950s settled, Operation Paperclip stood as one of the most consequential and controversial intelligence efforts in modern history. What had begun as a desperate wartime scramble had quietly reshaped the scientific destiny of the United States. By the early 1960s, the influence of the German scientists was visible everywhere, from missile silos buried beneath the Midwest to the control rooms of Cape Canaveral. America's technological edge, once uncertain, had crystallized into dominance. And yet, the operation's success came wrapped in silence. Few citizens knew the name Paperclip, and fewer still understood how deeply it had altered the moral and political landscape of the Cold War. The measurable outcomes were staggering. Between 1945 and 1959, more than 1,600 scientists and engineers were brought into the United States under various iterations of the Paperclip program. Their combined expertise accelerated U.S. research by decades. The Redstone missile evolved into the Jupiter, which in turn became the backbone of early American nuclear deterrence. The knowledge of guidance systems and reentry physics developed by these teams directly contributed to the creation of the Atlas and Titan ICBMs, engines of global power that defined the era's balance of terror. In the process, the U.S. Army and newly formed Air Force built an institutional infrastructure for missile development that stretched from Alabama to California, employing tens of thousands of American engineers trained under German tutelage. The program's impact extended far beyond weaponry. Paperclip scientists introduced systematic engineering practices that became the backbone of modern aerospace research. Their emphasis on precision testing, redundancy systems, and documentation shaped how American laboratories operated for generations. Concepts such as stage separation, turbopump design, and gyroscopic stabilization, once arcane German secrets, became staples of U.S. engineering textbooks. Even in fields seemingly unrelated to rocketry, traces of paperclip innovation emerged. Metallurgy, cryogenics, high-speed aerodynamics, and early computer automation all advanced under the indirect influence of men once considered the enemy. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, these principles found their ultimate expression in the Saturn rocket program. The Saturn I and IB served as test beds, paving the way for the monumental Saturn V, the most powerful launch vehicle ever built. Each launch was the culmination of decades of refinement, every blueprint carrying within it the evolution of ideas that began at Piedmont. When Apollo 11 lifted off in July 1969, the engines that thundered beneath it were the technological descendants of a lineage that began in war. On television screens across the world, millions watched as Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, a moment hailed as the triumph of American ingenuity. Yet within NASA's archives, the names of von Braun, Rudolph, and countless other former paperclip scientists mark the pages of design logs and mission reports, a silent reminder of the operation's hidden origins. Beyond spaceflight, the paperclip legacy radiated into other scientific domains. In aeromedicine, former Luftwaffe doctors like Hubert de Strughold advanced research into human endurance and space physiology, earning him the controversial title of Father of Space Medicine. In chemistry and physics, captured German data contributed to breakthroughs in materials science and early nuclear research. Even the Central Intelligence Agency quietly benefited, using former Axis intelligence officers' technical methods in psychological and counterintelligence studies during the 1950s. The United States had not merely absorbed individuals, it had absorbed an entire culture of technical discipline and experimentation. By the late 1960s, the measurable rewards of Operation Paperclip were undeniable. America had not only caught up to its rivals, but surpassed them in nearly every field of strategic science. The Soviet Union might have launched the first satellite, but it was the United States that placed a man on the moon. The same rockets that had once delivered destruction to London now delivered astronauts into lunar orbit. The Cold War had created a strange symmetry: victory through appropriation, progress through contradiction. Yet the deeper consequences of paperclip were not found in laboratories, but in ethics. By turning enemy scientists into partners, the U.S. had effectively rewritten the boundaries of justice. War crimes were quietly ignored in favor of utility. Legal amnesties were granted to men who, under different circumstances, might have faced tribunals at Nuremberg. The logic was cold but effective: knowledge as absolution. For decades, this uneasy truth remained buried under layers of classification and patriotic myth. When journalists and historians later uncovered the full extent of paperclip's scope, the reaction was one of disbelief. The operation that had helped propel mankind to the moon had also shielded men complicit in some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Still, to those who had overseen it, paperclip was a necessary compromise, a decision made not in arrogance, but in fear. The Soviet threat loomed large, and in that shadow, moral clarity was a luxury America could not afford. As General Holger Toftoy once summarized in a classified report, in the Cold War, the spoils are measured not in conscience, but in capability. His words captured the essence of the age, a world where knowledge itself had become the ultimate weapon. By the time Operation Paperclip was officially terminated in 1959, its spirit had already become permanent. The German scientists it had imported were now naturalized Americans, their past sealed under decades of secrecy. The program's physical files were archived under vague, bureaucratic headings: technical assistance programs, foreign expertise integration, phrases that concealed more than they revealed. But the effects of Paperclip could not be archived. They lived on in every missile test, every satellite launch, every piece of technology that emerged from the laboratories it helped build. The operation had succeeded beyond its architects' wildest expectations. Yet, in its success lay a haunting question. Had the United States merely won a scientific race, or had it also inherited the moral burden of the men who helped it win? As the 1970s dawned, the gleaming legacy of Operation Paperclip began to fracture under the weight of revelation. The secrecy that had shielded its origins for decades slowly unraveled, pulled apart by journalists, declassified documents, and the emerging moral consciousness of a post-Vietnam, post-Watergate America. What had long been celebrated as a story of technological triumph now faced a harsher interpretation, a tale of compromise and concealment. The very program that had carried humanity into space had also carried with it the ghosts of a darker past. Investigations into the wartime activities of several Paperclip scientists began to surface. The Dora Mittelwerk trials in 1947 had already documented the horrific conditions in which V-2 rockets were built, factories carved into mountain tunnels where tens of thousands of slave laborers from concentration camps perished. Testimonies described starvation, disease, and execution under SS supervision. Yet many of the men implicated in overseeing this system were now living comfortably in America, some holding prestigious government positions. Among them was Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's closest collaborators and later the project manager for the Saturn V rocket. For decades, his record had been sanitized by the U.S. Army's Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. It wasn't until the 1980s that Rudolph's role in the use of forced labor became public, forcing him to quietly renounce his American citizenship and return to Germany. Others faced similar scrutiny. Hubertus Strughold, once lauded as the father of American space medicine, came under investigation for his involvement in unethical medical experiments conducted during the war. Though no formal charges were ever filed, his name was gradually removed from honors and institutions that had once celebrated him. These revelations did not undo the achievements of the space age, but they did alter the moral narrative. The heroes of technological progress were no longer untouchable icons. They were men shaped by a world that had chosen expediency over ethics. In the decades following, declassification brought clarity to what Operation Paperclip had truly been, a calculated act of strategic opportunism disguised as scientific cooperation. Internal memos released by the Department of Defense and CIA revealed the extent of deliberate deception. Security officials had rewritten biographies, destroyed incriminating files, and forged denazification certificates to ensure the scientists' safe passage into the U.S. system. A 1987 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office confirmed that the operations administrators had knowingly misled immigration authorities and even Congress about the past affiliations of many recruits. The moral cost of Paperclip was no longer hypothetical. It was documented in black and white. Yet the paradox persisted. For every expose that condemned Paperclip, there was a counterargument that defended it as a grim necessity. The Cold War had been a zero-sum contest, and its outcome, many argued, justified the means. Without Paperclip, America might not have reached the moon, might not have developed the missile systems that maintain the nuclear balance, might not have secured its dominance in aerospace engineering. To some, the program symbolized moral compromise. To others, it embodied pragmatic survival. The truth, as history often proves, lay somewhere in between. By the time of Wernher von Braun's death in 1977, public opinion toward him was sharply divided. To his admirers, he was a visionary who had turned the rocket into a vehicle of human progress. To his critics, he was an opportunist who had exchanged one master for another. In the decades that followed, his legacy, and by extension, the legacy of Operation Paperclip, became a mirror reflecting America's own contradictions, a nation capable of extraordinary innovation, yet willing to blur moral lines in pursuit of supremacy. The consequences of Paperclip were not limited to science or politics. They reshaped the very idea of accountability in modern warfare. The program set a precedent that knowledge could absolve history, that genius could outweigh guilt. It taught nations that after great conflicts, the victors would not only claim the spoils of land and power, but also the spoils of intellect. That lesson reverberated throughout the Cold War, influencing how both superpowers treated scientists, spies, and even defectors. Intelligence became currency, and morality became negotiable. Even today, the legacy of Paperclip endures in the tension between technological progress and ethical restraint. The rockets that once lifted men into space now serve as the foundation for interplanetary exploration, private space industries, and missile defense systems that define 21st century geopolitics. The knowledge seeded by Paperclip has transcended its origin, branching into fields from artificial intelligence to aerodynamics. But its origins remain a cautionary reminder that even the most brilliant human achievements can rise from the darkest compromises. By the close of the 20th century, Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret, but a subject of reflection. Museums displayed its relics. Historians debated its consequences. Some saw it as a story of redemption through progress. Others saw it as proof that victory in war often demands a surrender of ideals. Yet beneath all interpretations, one truth remained. Paperclip was the hinge upon which modern science turned, a moment when humanity decided that the pursuit of the future was worth rewriting the past. The story of Paperclip did not end with the rockets it launched, but with the question it left behind, a question that still haunts every age of innovation. Can civilization advance without repeating the moral blindness that gave it power? In the quiet decades that followed the Cold War, the echoes of Operation Paperclip lingered like a faint vibration beneath the triumphs of modern science. Every rocket launch, every satellite in orbit, every photograph of Earth from the blackness of space carried with it a dual legacy, one of brilliance and one of compromise. The program that had begun in secrecy under the shadow of moral ambiguity had given birth to achievements that redefined humanity's place in the universe. Yet the moral contradictions remained unresolved, buried beneath the steel and fire of technological progress. Operation Paperclip is more than a story about scientists and rockets. It is a story about how civilizations confront their own ethics when faced with the temptation of power. In 1945, the world stood at a crossroads. The victors of war, exhausted by years of destruction, found themselves enticed by the minds of their enemies, men whose genius had served a monstrous regime. To recruit them was to preserve knowledge. To reject them was to uphold principle. America chose knowledge, and that choice shaped not only the course of the Cold War, but the trajectory of modern history itself. The moral cost of that decision cannot be measured in numbers or launches. It resides in the uneasy awareness that progress can emerge from the same hands that once built destruction. The rockets that carried explorers into space were born from the same science that once carried explosives across Europe. The laboratories that advanced medicine and aeronautics were staffed by men whose wartime deeds would never stand the test of conscience. Operation Paperclip forced the modern world to confront an uncomfortable truth, that morality, when weighed against survival, often bends beneath the weight of ambition. And yet, history's paradox lies here. From those compromises came a transformation that lifted humanity beyond its cradle. The exploration of space, the leap from war to wonder, became a symbol of what was possible when knowledge transcended its origins. The same science that once divided the world ultimately helped unite it in awe. Operation Paperclip left behind no monuments, no medals, no official honors. Its monument is the sky itself, silent, vast, and eternal, carrying both the burden of its past and the promise of its future. As the decades fade, the story endures as a mirror for every generation that dares to reach too far, too fast. It asks a question that humanity must never stop asking. Can we build the future without repeating the sins of the past?